Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 218, The Origins of the English Reformation. So while Francis, Henry, and Charles were engaged in an elaborate dance over the future political history of Europe, another current was steadily pulling England toward a major religious reformation. I hope by this point you understand that there was no such thing as the Reformation. There was a German Reformation led by Luther, a Swiss Reformation led by Zwingli, and John Calvin's Genevan Reformation that would have massive influence across the continent, but especially in France, as we'll see. And those are only the major players that we've talked about so far. Each of these reformations was unique and driven in part by political concerns, but also very much by the individual personalities at play. Luther and Zwingli's personal animosity made collaboration between those two groups impossible. Frankly, Luther's animosity toward everyone made any collaboration with the Lutherans nigh on impossible, at least while he lived. The English Reformation is very important to the story of Western history. I think that's true for a number of reasons. But if I had to pick one, it'd be the influence of Reformed Christianity on the future United States. The United States is probably a very different country if the 13 original colonies were founded by Catholic Spain. The English Reformation is also absolutely unique compared to the German or Swiss Reformations, because the person driving the separation from Rome is not the person creating the new doctrine. In the case of Zurich in Germany, Zwingli and Luther were both the ones, eventually, pushing for a division from Rome, and the ones creating the new churches to replace the formerly Catholic ones. England is totally different. Henry VIII and then his successors, Mary, Edward, and ultimately Elizabeth, are the ones who have the responsibility for determining when and how to separate from Rome. But they are not theologians, though Henry probably would have considered himself the next best thing. The doctrine that becomes the Church of England is the product of the factions behind the scenes at court. Men like Cranmer and Cromwell were attempting to shape doctrine through Henry, but understood that they did not have the final say. This is very different from the situation in Zurich or Wittenberg. And of course, it's also worth noting that with England we get, for the first time, an entire kingdom willing to break with Rome. Not an individual Swiss canton or a principality within the Holy Roman Empire. So the stakes are different. Now, all of this is going on while the major events of state, things like the Battle of Pavia, are altering the political situation in Europe like a kaleidoscope. So I wanted to make sure that we had all of our major players introduced before we started to talk about the English Reformation. Mostly because Henry's decisions were very much influenced by political concerns. Very much influenced. Today, though, I want to take a step back and explore the origins of the English Reformation and bring us up to speed where we last left off in roughly 1526. England, as the calendar turned to the year 1500, was a Catholic kingdom through and through. Not a person in the nation could fail to recognize the symbols associated with Catholic theology. Above all, this meant the crucifix, from Latin meaning fixed to a cross. The image of Christ on the cross, eyes fixed toward heaven, sometimes shut, blood dripping down, were everywhere. They hung on rosaries. They were affixed to many buildings. And there was at least one in every single church in England. Christ's passion in 1500 was fully on display. Jesus' act of self-sacrifice restored the broken relationship between God and man, salvation was possible once more. There was a lot for people to think about as they gazed up at the crucifix. It was an amazing act of love and generosity that, in theory, defined what it meant to be a Christian. The Inquisition undercuts that idea ever so slightly, but don't worry, we'll get there someday. But it also encapsulated the idea that the power of the divine could be localized in a physical space. Most of all, however, it invited people to imitate in some way the life and the actions of Christ. After all, what was the point of all this if not to be like Jesus? At its heart, that was what the English Reformation was all about. At least, that was what it was about for those who genuinely cared. There was a major political side as well. The Reformation was, to those genuine, a long collective argument about what was truly involved in the imitation of Christ. In other words, what did people need to do, and avoid doing, to achieve salvation? We discussed some of this before, but a quick review will help to understand the complaints. Medieval Christianity was profoundly sacramental. That is to say, that the material things could be made holy through ritual, gesture, and spatial experience. These items might include holy water candles, ashes, palm leaves, etc., etc. To an extent, the use of these items were quasi-magical, although even the medieval church did its best to disabuse people from the idea that a palm leaf could cure your ailing parent of a terminal illness. Penance and contrition were major parts of the process. Theologians argued whether or not you actually had to be sorry, contrition, or just wanted to be sorry, attrition. Most settled on the latter because it increased the penitential power of the priest during the sacraments of confession and last rites. Still, remember that in the medieval world, most people confess their sins only once per year during the week preceding Easter. Medieval Christianity had very low expectations for parishioners. The vast majority of the population was illiterate, and so the priest was absolutely essential as an intermediary. Lay Christians were expected to know how to say the Pater Noster, Our Father, and Ave Maria, Hail Mary, but that was about it. Reformed Christianity, as we already know, had much higher expectations for its parishioners. All of this relates to the power dynamic between the church and the laity. Medieval Catholicism wanted to make sure that the power remained with the church, so it deliberately set knowledge requirements low for laypersons. Reformed Christianity, to an extent, envisioned a more equal balancing of power. The other thing to keep in mind is that medieval Christianity was not monolithic, not at all. In fact, the late medieval Catholic Church was alarmingly unregulated. But as we have seen, that reality has a lot to do with the fact that the Pope and most bishops were concerned with secular matters, not whether each feast day was being followed in accordance with the scriptures. There were a lot of contradictions in the medieval church, and anyone who studied theology knew that. Their goal was, to a large extent, to just paper over the problems in the hope of keeping Europe's largest corporation going. Still, there's no suggestion that, as the 16th century dawned, medieval Catholicism was about to collapse under its own weight. Certainly not in Tudor England. But there were holes, many of which we already know about. And should the weather change, it's not hard to see where the damp might begin to set in. The rise of humanism would prove to be the first real challenge to Western Christianity since the schism between the Eastern Orthodox and Western Roman Catholic churches in the 11th century. Prior to the advent of humanism, scholasticism dominated the theological life of Europe. Scholastics believed that the scriptures needed to be interpreted with the help of pagan philosophers, namely Aristotle. Humanists critique scholasticism for many reasons. But above all that, scholastics believed separating theology from piety was a mistake. If you separated theology from piety, then Christianity for the common people became nothing more than meaningless magical sacraments. On the other hand, the Gospels became polluted with pagan logic. The goal was to harmonize theology and piety, not separate the two ideas. Erasmus was one of the first European thinkers to espouse this idea and more. He did it through satire and argument. In England, since that's where we're focusing, Erasmus found a kindred spirit in Thomas More, whom he met first on a trip to London in 1499. Although Erasmus was 10 years older than More, the two remained lifelong friends. Thomas was Erasmus's muse for his most famous treatise, The Praise of Folly, published in 1511. In 1516, More published his own counterpart to Praise of Folly, Utopia, literally Greek for no place. Utopia contains a few critical jibes at the church, but in terms of pragmatic reform agenda, Praise of Folly was much more thought out and exhaustive. Erasmus stressed that a renewed engagement with Christ could only come about if Europeans renewed their engagement with the New Testament. Medieval Christianity did not disregard the Bible as many sources from decades ago blithely assert. Erasmus's main issue was more with the quality of the text. The Vulgate, meaning common in Latin, was produced by St. Jerome all the way back in the 4th century CE. For some time now, the Vulgate had been under intense scrutiny of humanist scholars who found it lacking. What Erasmus believed was needed was a new translation of the original Greek into Latin, or at the very least, a corrected Latin translation alongside the original Greek. Erasmus finally succeeded in 1516 in printing a new Bible, the Novum Instrumentum, in Basel, with a Latin translation alongside the original Greek. From there, Erasmus made his intention clear. The Bible needed to be written in the vernacular. It was crucial that people be able to read the scriptures for themselves. Even, he wrote, those most barbarous of peoples, the Scots and the Irish. Harsh, Erasmus. Harsh. But the old centers of English learning, Cambridge and Oxford, both rejected Erasmus's new translation and wouldn't even consider a vernacular copy. The reality remained that Erasmus and his supporters were outliers. They were the ones pushing reform, while the waves of existing clergy and the establishment pushed back. But Erasmus was not likely to burn for his ideas. Henry VIII enjoyed his company, and Erasmus himself wrote that Henry, quote, still speaks often of me, with as much admiration and devotion as anyone else. The printing of Erasmus's Bible was far from controversial at the time. Pope Leo X endorsed it in 1519. A range of European monarchs, from Francis I to Henry VIII, wrote open supportive letters, entreating the man to continue his work. Frankly, this is probably because no one saw this as a watershed moment. Scholasticism was far from dead. The shelves at Oxford and Cambridge during the period from 1515 to 1520 were full of humanist and scholastic works sitting side by side. In 1519, the professor of Greek at Cambridge extolled the virtues of studying classical authors, but he simultaneously praised men like Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus. It was not an either-or situation. Scholasticism was the oldest and most established lens through which to interpret the Bible, but it had by no means been the only throughout the Middle Ages. Perhaps humanism and scholasticism could coexist after all. At the time in 1519, it was hard to see how much the European world was changing. It's only through hindsight that we begin to understand that the world was never going to be the same. Prior to Luther in 1517, the burden for marrying the ideas of the past and scholasticism to reform fell upon reform-minded bishops. Archbishop Warham in England was one such man. He and many others believed much of the change needed had to come from within. They needed, in the words of More's Utopia, fewer yet holier priests. Clerical education remained poor in the early 16th century. To an extent, the priesthood had never completely recovered from the Black Death, 2.5 centuries earlier. Many people were critical of uneducated priests getting drunk in taverns and bringing down the reputation of the church in general. But all these men agreed that the impetus for change needed to come from within, with a greater emphasis on education, etc. Chief among these proponents of reform in England was Dean Colet of London. Priests, he bemoaned, now hardly differed from laymen, quote, except by our tonsured hair and crown. In a February 1512 sermon, Colet revisited this theme, demanding reform. He argued that 4 evils blighted the church: pride, carnal lust, secular business, and worldly covetousness, especially the practice of accumulating as many benefices as possible. But he continued to stress that the new legislation was not necessary to address any of these issues. The church need only enforce existing rules and regulations, and the matter would quickly be brought to a head. The church also needed to do a much better job of screening its candidates. The, quote, broad gate of holy orders was itself the, quote, well of evils. If the church simply choked up on who got in and then focused on providing those men with the proper education, Colet argued, almost all of the church's problems would disappear. Now, to be fair, to late medieval religion, many scholars have begun to question Colet's criticisms. For one, he was a downright hypocrite. Colet bemoaned the practice of holding multiple benefices, while he himself was funded through a rectory at Suffolk and 2 canonries at Yark and Salisbury, none of which he visited with any regularity. Moreover, if we just step back for a moment, we will realize that his solution was entirely too idealistic. It doesn't surprise me at all that a vaunted academic sought to answer the church's troubles in the hallowed halls of academia. But was it realistic to turn away uneducated but perhaps pious individuals who wanted to be a part of the church? Who would replace them? Colet, in other words, thought that the answer was for everyone to be like him. This was both hypocritical and overly idealistic. Finally, Colet's educational standards were simply unattainable for the bulk of the clergy. Not every priest has to be a theologian, nor was it practical to make every priest into one. The church needed a lot of priests. So while reformers consistently argued that the answer was less priests, they ignored the reality that the church needed a lot of manpower to keep it running. Around 1510, historians estimate that there were around 40,000 priests in England, and another 10,000 in the holy orders. There were a little over 2 million people in England at that time, meaning that the clergy made up about 2.5% of the total population. That's a lot of priests. The priesthood at the time also required no formal training. Significant numbers did attend a university, but those with higher education remained in the minority. Now, the humanists scoffed at the priests, but we really have to question their haughty criticisms. These humanists were, almost to a man, the most educated people in whatever court or kingdom that they happened to be in. Were the local clergy up to their standards? Of course not. Then again, nor was anyone. But were the local clergy totally illiterate in Latin, as some humanist critiques assert? Certainly not. Their job involved using Latin on a daily basis. It's extremely unlikely that the vast majority of priests had no clue what the scribbles on the page meant. And frankly, even if they did, there are almost no records of anyone complaining about it. Certainly, pluralism, the holding of multiple benefices, was widespread. But normally, whoever held the benefice paid another priest to service it. So it's not like there were a bunch of parishes just sitting empty or something. Now, Colet was right to go after the tithe. There was no one issue more likely to get lay people angry than the tithe. And there are plenty of examples of conflict, legal, verbal, and sometimes physical, between the clergy and parishioners over the payment of the tithe, 10%. But again, while some of these disputes were egregious, they still represented a very small number compared to the kingdom as a whole. For example, in the 1520s, there were only 10 total tithe suits out of the 1,148 parishes that made up the Diocese of Norwich. That's an incredibly small percentage. Now, certainly, like anyone, the medieval English paid as little as they could to the church, probably less than what was required. But they never questioned that they had to pay. The other issue that seems to have been much ado about nothing was priestly chastity. It's easy to look at examples like Rodrigo Borgia and paint the whole clergy as morally a reprobate with a super broad brush. But historians estimate that, at least amongst the local English clergy, around 90% were living chaste lives. An easier target if we want to look at morality is just how much wealth the clergy possessed. These are men who are supposed to render up to Caesar what is Caesar's. But upon closer inspection, they don't appear to be doing a whole lot of rendering. By European standards, English dioceses were large. There were only 17 for the entire realm. They were also famously wealthy. Of the 40 richest bishoprics in Europe, 12 were English. Generally, any parish worth more than £100 per year went to absentee careerists, who then paid a local priest a pittance to administer his flock. Now, one thing we do need to remember when thinking about late medieval religion is that the Mass was about the magical process of recreating Christ's passion for the benefit of the attendees and the dead. There wasn't really any of what we would call preaching today. It's interesting to remember that the homily, the part where the priest, pastor, or a preacher talks about whatever the subject of today's sermon was, wasn't a part of the medieval Sunday service. Technically, the priest only had to give a sermon once per quarter. Still, there's plenty of evidence that people wanted to hear preaching. Many English contemporaries describe their favorite priests as, quote, pulpit men. There was a growing feeling among both the lay people and the clergy that an ability to expound the word of God was the highest and purest manifestation of priestly calling. And here is where the reformers are going to make the most hay. The Protestant insistence on the clergyman's identity as a preacher grew out of, as much as it reacted against, the evolving attitudes of the Middle Ages. This is especially true in England. Now, the priests were separate from the religious orders. The holy orders are a whole different animal here, and much more subject to criticism than the clergy. There were probably around 10,000 members of the myriad different religious orders, and there were around 900 of those in the year 1500. So if we do the math, that means 11 people per religious order. Hence, all we can really say about the religious orders is that they were extraordinarily diverse. The vast majority of those 10,000 people belonged to the Benedictines, or the Black Monks. England was very unique in that the Black Monks provided personnel for 9 priories and several cathedral churches, including Canterbury, Durham, and Winchester. Many more people were critical of the monastic orders than of the clergy. However, to a large extent, that's because the monastic orders were also criticized by the clergy, against whom they fought essentially never-ending turf wars. We get all the same allegations of moral impropriety, though where that did happen, it was almost certainly in the smaller houses, where behavior was just harder to police. If English monasticism was corrupt, then it was the corruption of comfort, convention, and compromise, rather than depravity and decadence. Despite the fact that the late medieval church was much less corrupt than some later, mostly Protestant, histories made it out to be, many contemporaries still believe it needed reform. Erasmus was unsympathetic to the monastic orders and argued they needed reform or to be done away with. Other reform-minded bishops looked around and saw enough graft and quasi-corruption that they felt it was in their best interests to get some of these issues dealt with. But the monastic orders are a good example, however, of why reform was so difficult. Not for the last time today will I introduce one of the most important problems facing the church, and specifically church reform: jurisdiction. The key issue holding back the reform of the church was who had jurisdiction to make it happen. Many monastic houses, including the Cistercians and all the friars, claimed that they did not fall under the jurisdiction of local bishops. They were under the jurisdiction of the Reformed Benedictine Abbey of Cluny, way off in Burgundy. It was hard, if not impossible, to attempt a reform of the monastic houses if they could claim an exemption from local control. Sure, the monastery at Cluny might get around to sending someone at some point, but that was far from a given, and there was no guarantee they would do anything once they got there. Bishops especially resented this infringement on their local rights. And finally, there was someone who was willing to do something about it. A man we've already met in our story, Cardinal Wolsey. Wolsey was arguably the highest-ranking churchman in England and enjoyed the absolute confidence of King Henry VIII. Now he would put those tools to work. In 1518, with Henry's backing, Wolsey was made an official papal legate in England. The formal basis for this request was to reform the religious orders, but it gave Wolsey unprecedented powers in England over the church, as he was now the Pope's very representative. Then, in 1524, the Pope made his legateship permanent. If anything, it wasn't Henry's great matter, that we'll spend almost the entire next episode on, that precipitated the English Reformation, as much as this moment when Wolsey became a papal legate. But again, I want to stress this. Wolsey wanted to intervene in the monasteries because he was part of the church. By and large, there's little evidence to suggest anything other than a complete ambivalence on the part of most English people when it came to the monastic orders. They didn't hate them. They didn't revere them. They were just kind of, well, meh when it came to them. The fact of the matter was, unless you were a tenant to a monastic house, you probably rarely, if ever, interacted with a member of any religious order. There were, of course, very popular negative stereotypes of monks and friars circulating in English text at the time. Both the Canterbury Tales and the Ballads of Robin Hood are two such examples. But again, these are more likely little more than hyperbole. These are not examples of widespread anti-clericalism. If anything, they're examples of medieval piety, of disappointed expectation. Still, many in the clergy were nothing if not self-righteous. The disconnect between how the clergy viewed itself and how it actually was in real life was a major issue as the 16th century dawned. Wolsey's accumulation of papal authority finally gave someone the strength necessary to right the ship. But how would he do it? As I mentioned earlier, the primary question when it came to church reform was not whether it was needed. The vast majority of people seemed to have agreed that it was. But who had the authority to carry it out? There are many who paint the Reformation in general as a great showdown, maybe the great showdown between church and state. They're not wrong to a large extent. The weird concurrent jurisdiction that persisted throughout the Middle Ages was not going to work forever. The needs and wants of the secular rulers did not always coincide with those of a supranational church. Nothing ultimately inhibited reform more than disagreements about who should have primary responsibility for carrying it out. Back in July 1511, Pope Julius II famously called the first church council since the one that ended the Avignon Schism. There was real hope that this council might be able to address some of the reformist concerns. But this council, the Fifth Lateran Council, was fool's gold from the start. It did not address anything related to reform. In fact, Julius only called the council because his then great rival, Louis XII of France, had summoned his own ecumenical council of rebellious cardinals at Pisa. In other words, the Fifth Lateran Council was nothing more than just another stage in the tug-of-war between the French monarchy and Rome. Now, for Julius, the gambit worked. Louis XII saw his council mocked and derided. But the real loser in all of it was the cause of reform. The clock, after all, was ticking. In light of later events, I suppose it's remarkable how few rumblings of anti-papal sentiment one gets in England at the time. Honestly, this is probably because the Pope just wasn't a major figure in England. Probably well fewer than 1,000 people traveled to Rome each year, either on business or on a pilgrimage. Other than the guy who, ostensibly, signed the indulgence, few English people ever had reason to think about the Pope. Don't get me wrong, this is still an extremely religious age. But your average person was not a theologian. They didn't sit around debating abstract questions of Christ's divinity. They just wanted to see their crops sown on time. One person who was very concerned about the power of the Pope, however, was the king. Popes and kings had many mutual and compatible interests. Where these interests clashed, European monarchs and popes had worked out established mechanisms for dealing with them. Differences of opinion between kings and popes was an endemic issue, not an epidemic. Things were always worked out. Or, I should say, at least up until the 16th century, they had always been worked out, sometimes because one or the other party died. During Henry VII's first years, there was a strong sense of cooperation between the Pope and the English monarchy. The Pope had, after all, sided with Henry Tudor, even before Bosworth Field. Now, the main issue between Henry VII, again, we're talking about Henry VIII's dad here, and the Pope was the concept of sanctuary, and this is going to continue on. This is, of course, the idea that you can flee to a church and no one can remove or harm you. Henry VII, again, didn't much care about the right unless the person you were talking about was a rebel and a traitor. That was a different matter. English judges ruled that the rights of sanctuary did not apply to traitors. The Pope himself wouldn't go that far. He only agreed that if someone left sanctuary, they couldn't go back and claim it a second time, and that it was acceptable to post guards around a sanctuary to prevent nefarious comings and goings. Now, initially, as Henry VIII came to power in 1509, there were no signs that anything was about to change. Frankly, the young king seemed more enamored of the Pope than his father. Papalism and Francophobia were the twin pillars of Henry's first few years on the throne. Henry even got his own sweet title, remember? Defender of the Faith. Though he did have to wait until 1521 to get it, and only then because he wrote against Martin Luther. But in reality, both Henry and the different popes he interacted with had their own agendas, and both sides used the other as they saw fit to accomplish those objectives. The papacy hoped to use Henry to balance out French power in northern Italy. Henry believed, foolishly and romantically, that the Pope would support his claim to the French throne. In one critical way, Henry did tend to get his way. Taxation. Technically, clergy were supposed to be exempt from royal taxation. However, English kings had long ago found ways to circumvent these rules by levying parallel demands both through Parliament and the convocations of the clergy, which is kind of like a parliament, but for the clergy. Remember that. We're going to talk about it more, and it's going to come back big time next episode. In the past, English monarchs had blithely stamped these taxes quote-unquote defense spending or something reasonable to add a little veneer over what was nothing more than the naked taxation of the church. By Henry's day, the pretense was gone, and clerical taxation made up of around £9,000 per year in royal income. Sometimes someone complained, but it mattered very little. The church had plenty of money and everyone knew it, so the church paid, like everybody else. Henry and different humanists might complain about the stereotypical uneducated priest, but they certainly couldn't complain about early Tudor bishops. These men were, almost without exception, university graduates, albeit in law rather than theology. By and large, they took their vows of celibacy seriously, Wolsey being the exception. And they actually visited their diocese, Wolsey, again, being the exception. All in all, your average English bishop was much closer to the humanist ideal than anywhere else in Europe. But, as I keep hinting, if any churchman was the subject of criticism, it was the most powerful one in England, Cardinal Wolsey. Summoned to a synod of bishops called by Wolsey in 1519, Bishop John Fisher complained about the unrelenting secular business facing the clergy. Quote, "For sundry times when I have settled and fully bent myself to the care of my flock committed unto me, to visit my diocese, to govern my church, and to answer the enemies of Christ, straightways hath come a messenger for one cause or the other, sent from higher authority, by whom I have been called to other business." End quote. Now, this speech, coupled with Archbishop Fox's later resignation letter, contained barely hidden barbs targeting Wolsey, who was by about 1,000,000 miles the most secular clergyman in England. It's interesting, but for all the focus that's been heaped on Wolsey over the centuries, he remains a little bit of an enigma, even in the most recently written histories. Was he a serious reformer, or the epitome of ecclesiastical corruption? The jury remains out to this day. Moreover, was he universally despised from the word go, or did everyone just turn on him after his fall from grace? in 1529. After all, most historians still argue over whether or not his rise to power was the harbinger of the coming storm, or whether his existence kept the English Church moving forward until it was derailed by unforeseen events. I tend to take a more positive view of Wolsey. He seems to me like Rodrigo Borgia if Rodrigo Borgia had been born in England and not Spain. A man with immense ambition and no real internal constraints. Wolsey was going to do whatever he could get away with. Really, what made Wolsey unusual was that he was delegated papal authority. He maybe wasn't really unusual in terms of his personality. He was just unusually powerful. Wolsey's privileged position gave him the ability to rein in the religious orders and then convene synods of bishops as he needed. As legate, he could receive petitions that would have gone to Rome, but which he now decided. He was, almost literally, the Pope of England. He could cut across the different jurisdictions of religious orders, York and Canterbury, much to the chagrin of many people. By 1522, Wolsey had set up his own Legantine court, staffed with super-aggressive church lawyers. Most bishops, like the secular nobility, tried their best to work with Wolsey, who remained first and foremost the king's man. Wolsey only had his position as legate thanks to Henry's support. And Henry was not alone, by the way, as a monarch who wanted his right-hand man to have papal authority within his kingdom. Louis XII had persuaded then Pope Julius II to grant sweeping Legantine powers to one of his French cardinals before the two men fell out. Of course, many have argued that examples like this show that the popes were colluding in an erosion of papal authority. To an extent, in hindsight, I guess that's true. Certainly Rome, when it appointed a legate in a faraway kingdom, was delegating day-to-day authority. But there was nothing about this that was pointing inexorably toward schism. That's the key distinction to understand. The Pope was in Rome and unable to deal with the minutiae facing Wolsey in England, and nor did most of them care to. Frankly, appointing legates favored by their kings gave the system more responsiveness and flexibility. In the case of Spain, a similar situation led to a strengthening of the Catholic position, not a destruction of it. I do think that Wolsey's appointment as legate is a watershed moment in the English Reformation, but I don't think it had to be. That, as they say, is just how the cookie crumbled. Wolsey's position as legate was intended initially, at least, to deal with the religious orders. But the reason Henry needed him appointed is extremely telling and gets back to that word I said was of paramount importance: jurisdiction. All the way back in 1515, the year Wolsey got his cardinal's hat, rival understandings of what was meant by reform came into open conflict. The origins of this dispute lie in the existence of the parallel systems of justice between the church and the state that would have made late medieval Europe mind-boggling, even to the most astute modern procedural attorney. The common law that was administered in the central courts of the King's Bench, Common Pleas, and Exchequer radiated outward to the localities through assize courts presided over by itinerant royal justices. The professional common law lawyer was trained at the London Inns of Courts. It was, in other words, an all-English affair. The church courts, by contrast, were components of a Europe-wide pyramid of justice capped by the papal curia in Rome. Common law attorneys generally did not and could not present claims before ecclesiastical courts. Now, in theory, the lines of demarcation between the two laws were clear. Canon law dealt with matters of faith, and common law everything else. So canon law dealt with matters like marriage, adultery, heresy, and the internal running of the church. The problem was that there was many areas within which there was a lot of overlap. Wills and testaments were one such area. Testamentary matters were part of the spiritual preparation for death and hence canon law. But there were also transfers of property and hence common law. Where the deceased left debts, both secular and ecclesiastical courts could claim an interest. What this meant was that the litigants could, and the savvy ones did, try and pick and choose where they filed their case in order to achieve the best outcome. Plus, oftentimes one system or the other was cheaper and faster, depending on your circumstances. But the situation was not a free-for-all. Judges in both court systems often diverted cases to the other where they felt it was appropriate. The offense, which is going to prove to be the most crucial between 1515 and the Act of Supremacy in 1534, was called praemunire. Praemunire, codified in 1353, 1365, and again in 1393, meant, quote, scheming to disinherit the king and his crown. The term derives from the Latin praemunire facias, which translates into, quote, that you have been forewarned to appear. It was a law which, on its face, was designed to make sure no one could skip out on royal jurisdiction. The original purpose was expressly intended to prevent unwarranted papal interference with the exercise of royal administration and justice. It was not intended to deny legitimate claims of canon law or impede the operations of the church courts of England. At least, that wasn't the original intent. But the loose drafting of the 1395 version of the statute led to the exact opposite conclusion. Clever lawyers could now argue praemunire whenever they wanted to get a case out of the ecclesiastical courts. So that was a score for the crown. But the church was far from knocked out. The church was an institution, and the crown was, well, dependent on whoever wore it. The Wars of the Roses in the middle decades of the 15th century, and the resulting chaos gave the church room to eat away at many of these restrictions. Moreover, Edward IV, eager to get the church to approve of his dynasty, granted the church a sweeping charter of liberties. This was the situation when the Tudors came to power. They had a powerful tool to curtail ecclesiastical authority, praemunire, but they had to contend with a church that was significantly more powerful than it had been before 1450. Another tool that the king had was his role as, I'll say, national arbitrator. Technically, the king was the fount of justice. He had the right to arbitrate between any of his subjects when a dispute arose. The Tudors, however, adroitly used this policy to rule on cases that involved disputes between royal and church officials. And I bet you can guess how many times the church officials won. One case gives us an example of this. In 1516, a member of Parliament was murdered on his way to the session by Sir John Savage. Yeah, his name really fits the bill. Savage took refuge at a local priory, but was dragged out and hauled before the king for justice. Of course, Savage claimed the right of sanctuary and wanted the case removed to the ecclesiastical courts. Henry disagreed. Without so much as glancing about for precedent, he simply decreed that the original intent of the sanctuary law was not, quote, to serve for voluntary murder and larceny, end quote, committed outside the sanctuary. And just like that, with a wave of his hand, Henry wiped a crucial medieval liberty away. It would not be the last time he would do it. Another widely believed abused ecclesiastical right was the, quote, benefit of the clergy. This gave anyone who was even arguably clergy the right to avoid punishment in the secular courts. The real problem was that this right applied to everyone. Not just priests, but clerks in the so-called minor orders could claim the benefit even though they had no intention of ever being ordained. Only secular courts could order torture. Only secular courts could sentence people to physical punishment and death. So if you killed someone and were a clerk in a minor order, it behooved you to quickly claim the benefit for a slap on the wrist as opposed to literal torture and execution. The English were right to be concerned about these abuses, and beginning in 1489, Parliament started to tighten up on the practice. The Act restricted the benefit to those who were actually ordained. Members of the minor orders could still claim the benefit, but only once. You were branded on the thumb after availing yourself to avoid cheating. A subsequent act in 1497 removed the privilege entirely from deserters from the royal army and those convicted of petty treason, murdering a master or employer. It should go without saying that high treason, treason against the crown, had always been considered outside the benefit scope. In 1512, Parliament added another list of particularly heinous offenses which were beyond the pale of the benefit. Crucially, the Church went along with all these efforts at reform. Up until the late 15-teens, there were no distinctions between reformers and conservatives who wanted to defend the traditional liberties of the Church. For everyone within the Church, reform was supposed to come from within. When Parliament codified reform, it was because the clergy already agreed to it. That delicate balance was about to get tested in a real way. Back in Rome, this was the kind of reform that the Pope had in mind. For example, in 1514, Pope Leo issued a major reforming papal bill, Supernae Despotenis Arbito. It posited a crackdown on a variety of abuses, including, not a bit ironically, given that it was coming from the Medici Pope, an overhaul on the lifestyles and duties of the cardinals. But couched in all this reform was the emphatic restatement that, quote, human and divine law give laymen no control over ecclesiastical persons, end quote. In other words, hands off. Leo's problem was that the crowned heads of Europe were no longer just willing to swallow this position. In 1515, Henry issued a major statement, ecclesiastical law having again butted up against royal prerogative. He wrote as follows: By ordinance and the sufferance of God, we are King of England, and the kings of England in times past have never had any superior but God alone. Wherefore, know you well that we will maintain the right of our crown and of our temporal jurisdiction, as well in this point as in all others, in as ample as wise of any of our progenitors have done before us. And as to your, Pope, decrees, we are well informed that you yourselves of the spirituality do expressly contrary to the words of many of them, as has been well shown to you by some of our spiritual council. Nevertheless, you interpret your decrees at your pleasure. Wherefore, consent to your desire more than our progenitors have done in time past. We will not. End quote. The idea that the divine right of kings circumvented the Pope was growing in power and persuasiveness. King Henry did not need the Pope's approval because his power and authority were derived directly from God. Dangerously, as far as the Church was concerned at least, that also meant that Henry was just as qualified as the Pope to interpret God's will. When Archbishop Warham tried in desperation to claim the convocation of clergy had the right in any dispute to appeal to Rome at its own cost, his pleas were met with a deafening royal silence. The following years saw increased tensions over the issue of sanctuary, but during the period of Wolsey's legateship, there were no major explosions. Wolsey was able, for most of the early 1520s, to prevent church-state conflicts from getting out of hand. He had the papal power, and critically, he had Henry's trust. As for Henry, at some point after 1515, he codified what had likely been his position since the start of his reign. In 1509, when he took the throne, he swore to, quote, keep and maintain the right and liberties of the Holy Church of old time, granted by the righteous Christian kings of England. But at some point he changed the wording. Now, he said, he meant to uphold only, quote, the rights of the Holy Church of England, not prejudicial to his jurisdiction and dignity royal." End quote. This is the first time we see the mention of the Church of England in a royal document. The change in language was subtle, but important. The Church's rights were not God-given nor inalienable. They were granted by the king and could be taken away by the king. Ideologically, Henry was drawing a line in the sand. The clergy were doing the same. After 1515, the Convocation issued a statement that they would serve the crown, quote, "as far as their order and profession shall suffer them." In other words, the clergy were declaring themselves to be a caste above. Loyalty to God came before loyalty to the crown. This meant, in theory, that the clergy would do everything that it could to serve Henry, but it would not commit heresy. Problem with this was that as far as some members of the clergy were concerned, even criticizing the clergy was heretical. Next week, all of our well-laid plans get laid asunder as Henry's great matter shoves them all away. As always, if you're interested in more content, check out the website, westerncivpodcast.com. If you're interested in more Western Civ, try a free trial of Western Civ 2.0, link in the show notes. Or to support the show directly, become a patron at patreon.com/Western Civ.